Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I'm Gloria Blackwell, AAUW's Chief Executive Officer. We are so excited that you're here today to join us for my conversation with Dr. Karen Cook Bell. I just wanted to let you know that this program is being recorded and it will be available in a few days on the website at aauw.org. So you can take notes now, or you can share it with others and have an opportunity to see it again in the future. Everyone will be on mute during this conversation. Please use the chat box if you have any technical questions. We want to thank everyone who pre-submitted some very thoughtful questions. Dr. Cook Bell has certainly will attempt to address them, and we probably won't be able to get to the question box, but we'll try. So let's go ahead and get started. I am so pleased to introduce AAUW American Fellowships alumna. She's also one of our review panelists and Associate Professor of History and the Wilson H. Elkins Endowed Professor at Bowie State University, Dr. Karen Cook Bell. Dr. Cook Bell's areas of specialization include slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and women's history. She has published Claiming Freedom, Race, Kinship, and Land in 19th Century Georgia, which won the Georgia Board of Regents Excellence in Research Award. She is editor of Southern Black Women's Struggle for Freedom During the Civil War and Reconstruction, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press. Her scholarship has appeared in the Journal of African American History, Georgia Historical Quarterly, Passport, Converging Identities, Blackness in the Contemporary Diaspora, and Slavery and Freedom in Savannah. She is also a contributor for Black Perspectives, the blog of the African American Intellectual History Society. Dr. Cook Bell earned her master's and a PhD in history from Howard University. There's obviously so much more that I could tell you about Dr. Cook Bell and her impressive career, but we're going to drop a link to her bio in the chat so we can get started with our discussion for today. Dr. Cook Bell has joined me today for a discussion around her current book, Running from Bondage, Enslaved Women and the Remarkable Fight for Freedom in Revolutionary America. It was a finalist for the Pauli Murray Book Prize for Best Book in African American Intellectual History, and her book tells the compelling stories of enslaved women who comprised 1/3 of all runaways and the ways in which they fled or attempted to flee bondage during and after the Revolutionary War. Dr. Cook Bell, let's jump into the conversation. Let's start it off. Welcome to our webinar today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
So you were awarded an AAUW American Fellowship. So can you tell us a bit about that award and how it impacted your research and studies during that time?
Yes, certainly. So the fellowship from the AAUW came at a critical time for me in 2006. I was working full-time as an archivist at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, as well as balancing my home life as a wife and mother. So the fellowship allowed me to take time off from working full-time to really focus on writing the dissertation, which was 50% complete. In fact, my research for the dissertation introduced me to the women who are explored in my book, Running from Bondage. So without the AAUW fellowship, I likely would not have completed my dissertation because my dissertation clock was running out of time. So I was really able to focus on writing the dissertation, which can be very difficult for women juggling children, work, and home.
Absolutely. I'm very happy to hear that AAUW provided that funding in at a very critical time to support you. And we hear that quite a bit, the funding that we provide, particularly for those who are attempting scholarship while mothering at the same time. It can be incredibly difficult for women as they're pursuing their educational studies. So I'm glad it was very valuable for you, and we're happy that it helped propel you to the completion of your dissertation. So let's move into talking about the particular subject that we're going to talk about today. As a scholar of African American history and slavery, sort of what was your motivation for taking on this particular subject?
So yes, as I mentioned, my dissertation, which became my first book, Claiming Freedom, first introduced me to women who fled slavery during the late 1700s. And this led me to question how widespread was the escape of enslaved women. And my research led me to the American Revolution, which was a watershed moment in which thousands of enslaved people escaped, and which, according to historian Benjamin Quarles, saw the first large-scale slave rebellion in American history. So, of course, I wanted to tell the story of these women who fled or who attempted to flee slavery during that time. I also believed it was important to take a deep dive into examining the lived experiences of the women who fled and to really think deeply about how they sought to reimagine their world and create new spaces for themselves during a very violent era. I was able to examine over 1,000 runaway slave advertisements, as well as trial records of escaped slaves, and also used an interview with George Washington's escaped slave owner judge to write the book. And really, my research and writing have focused on war and society, and both the American Revolution and the Civil War were transformative events that impacted African American freedom. So that is how I became really involved in writing this book on Black women and their quest for freedom during the Revolutionary period.
Great. So let's take a minute and set the stage for us now, and move into telling us about, who were the enslaved women of the Revolutionary War, and why is there a need to shed light on their experiences?
So yes, well, scholars once considered Black participation in the American Revolution to be marginal. However, over the past 5 decades, numerous books and articles on this subject have dispelled that idea, and Black participation in the American Revolution is now considered an integral part of the story of American freedom. Of course, Crispus Attucks was the first to die during the Revolutionary period. So the experiences of Black women, of course, who fled slavery during the Revolution has largely not been examined. And a part of the reason why that is the case is because the history books had previously ignored the experiences of Black women during slavery. And really, this began to change with the publication of Deborah Gray White's book, Aren't I a Woman?, which examines the Black female experience during slavery. However, even with this publication, the consensus in the scholarship was that Black women did not flee slavery because of family ties and responsibilities. In other words, their positions as mothers and wives prevented them from escaping slavery. Now, my book refutes that idea, and I demonstrate that motherhood often served as a catalyst for attempted escape during the American Revolution. The underlying causes of women's flight were efforts to protect their bodies and their womanhood against the violence and exploitation that really was an everyday feature of their lived experience, as well as to protect their children from the harmful effects of slavery. Now, the average age of a self-emancipated woman was 22, and women between the age of 18 and 25 really predominate in the advertisements. Girls as young as 13 escape independently, and women as old as 62 escape with their daughters and their families. And what was especially surprising is that women also ran away pregnant. Now, it's also important to note that some enslaved women pursued their freedom through the courts during this period. In Massachusetts, for example, Elizabeth Freeman was the first enslaved woman to successfully sue for her freedom and win. Freeman was enslaved in Sheffield, Massachusetts as a domestic, and she sued for her freedom on the grounds that the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution declared all men are born free. And really, in an act radical for the times, she believed this provision also applied to her. the jury surprisingly ruled in her favor and ordered her enslaver, John Ashley, to pay 30 shillings in restitution and to cover her court costs. So certainly in thinking about the importance of this topic and looking at the enslaved women during this period, I think we really have to underscore the fact that Black women were in the forefront of efforts to dismantle slavery, and they protested with their feet by running away.
That's really fascinating, And, do you think that this is ignored history, and is it part of the broader issues of gender and scholarship?
Yeah, so certainly the 1800s has an enormous body of scholarship on the experiences of enslaved women and freedom-seeking slave men and women. But we don't have the same volume of scholarship on the Revolutionary Era and the early Republic, really the period from 1780 to 1820. So through this study, I wanted to show it is possible to use the fragments of enslaved women's lives to create a fuller picture of them and their role in this long war against slavery. Also, Black women's resistance during this period really matters in the historical discourse on slave resistance because the history books have tended to focus on resistance as exclusively an experience belonging to Black men. In other words, only Black men resisted. So by examining the histories of women who escaped slavery, we began to more fully understand and appreciate the ways in which enslaved women, who comprise 1/3 of all runaways, were an integral part of the early movement to abolish slavery, what we call the abolitionist movement. So enslaved women who were mothers escaping bondage really disrupts the narrative that all female slaves were bound to their enslavers through their offspring. Now, of course, the figures for how many enslaved women escaped slavery are not definitive because not every runaway generated an advertisement. It is certainly possible that the number of runaways was at least double the existing figures that we have, since not all newspapers were published consistently, and many enslavers did not advertise for the return of runaways, as historian David Wallstreicher argues. And of course, capturing a runaway slave was expensive. One had to pay for the advertisement, the jail costs, as well as the reward. And time again in the advertisements that I examined, Black women ran away with their child or children. So this gender dimension of resistance is really important to understand. And of course, as I mentioned, motherhood really inspired Black women to escape, as many women ran away in an effort to maintain ties to their children or escaped in response to the death or sale of a child. And when we think about it, the violence that Black women experienced was the violation of their bodies and the theft of their children. So why would they not be involved in efforts to flee slavery?
Absolutely. And I think that your scholarship certainly shines an important light on, some of the things that people take as, being factual and the truth that really can be dispelled, because if you don't dig into that with your scholarly research, the assumptions that have been made over the years, tend to be the things that in the general knowledge of what people know, tends to be the truth. And it's certainly quite more nuanced than that when you think about what it means to have children and seeking freedom, and ensuring that not only are you considering your own value, but that of your family as well. And I appreciate the piece about the different stages and ages with which women did flee for freedom, and those who were younger and those who were older as well, even those who were pregnant at the time. Thank you. And so your research demonstrates, when we're talking about the Revolutionary War, that there was in fact 2 wars being waged during the Revolutionary era. First, the political revolution for independence from Great Britain, and a social revolution for emancipation and equality, in which Black women played a very active role. Can you talk about that, please?
Yes, so of course, enslaved people were very much aware of the politics of the revolution. They heard the word slave and slavery being bandied about as the colonists began to refer to themselves as being enslaved. So even before fighting began, they petitioned the legislatures for their freedom in places like Massachusetts, really drawing inspiration from the political ideology of the revolutionary crises in favor of their own natural rights. And the term natural rights, of course, was used by John Locke and, of course, later Thomas Jefferson to refer to these God-given rights that all human beings have. And one of those rights being, of course, the right to freedom. And really the ideals that are embodied in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, really resonated with enslaved women who used the rhetoric of the revolution to declare their right to freedom. Now, women heard about these ideals from listening to the conversations of their enslavers, as well as through the slave grapevine, which carried news from plantation to plantation and from city to city. And of course, the American Revolution really brought into sharp focus the paradox of slavery and freedom. On the one hand, of course, the colonists were fighting for their freedom from Great Britain. On the other hand, they were still maintaining the system of slavery. And of course, African-American women did contribute to the story of American independence because they too believed in the independence of the individual, and they valued in the most fundamental way what Thomas Jefferson and others would identify as these inalienable rights. Now, in terms of it being two revolutions, we see, of course, during the Revolutionary War, that women are seeking refuge with the British because they recognized that their best chances for freedom really resided with a British victory and a disruption of the existing social order. Now, the escape of enslaved women as well as men led men like Lord Dunmore and Sir Henry Clinton to issue two proclamations. Lord Dunmore's proclamation was issued in November of 1775, and the Philipsburg Proclamation was issued by Sir Henry Clinton in June of 1779. And both of these proclamations were instrumental because they promised freedom to slaves who would aid and assist the Loyalists in their fight against the American colonists. So this Declaration of Freedom was really important for the movement of African Americans during the Revolutionary War towards their freedom. Now, once women reached the lines of the British, they served in a number of roles, not only as cooks and laundresses, but also worked in ordnance, working with weaponry. And this was especially true when the British occupied Charleston, South Carolina. In fact, 40% of those who fled after the Philipsburg Proclamation was issued were, in fact, women. Now, women not only fled with family members, but also in groups without established kinship relations. And there were certainly regional variations in the flight of enslaved women during the Revolutionary period. For example, women who escaped from South Carolina and Georgia sought to escape to Florida, where for half a century, the Spanish provided freedom and refuge for escaped slaves who reached St. Augustine. They also found refuge with British troops following the Southern Campaign of 1779. And of course, in places like Virginia and Maryland, enslaved women sought to reach Philadelphia, which was under the control of British forces in 1777, as well as reach other northern destinations. In the northern and New England states, women sought to reach British forces during the early campaigns of the war and also endeavored to reach New York City. Now, in each of these regions, women sought to pass as free women. Now, the war certainly was very difficult in terms of hardships placed on those who were seeking their freedom. And only about 2 in every 3 fugitives survived the war. And of course, they faced tremendous obstacles even after they gained their freedom. Now, one of those obstacles was the pressure placed by American diplomats on the British to return those fugitive slaves who had escaped to the British lines. Of course, the British refused to return those slaves to the American colonists or the American states. So, of course, when we think about certainly this period and think about there being two revolutions, one revolution for independence from Great Britain, the other revolution being a social revolution for emancipation and equality, we see African Americans, both men and women, really demanding their freedom by running away. And for African American men, they also demanded their freedom through service in the war itself. So there were, in fact, two wars being waged: a revolutionary war for political independence and a war for emancipation and equality, led by Black women and men.
Excellent, thank you. So in your really extensive research that you have referred to, I think I was so interested in hearing about and reading about just some of the stories, the specific stories. And so, for you, were there specific stories that really brought home the experiences of enslaved women? And also, if you could talk a little bit about what were the physical and the emotional impacts of fleeing from bondage.
Yeah, so certainly in writing this book, I really wanted it to be readable. So one of my strategies was to foreground each chapter with the escape of an enslaved woman. And I wanted to give as much flavor as I could to the text. So I sprinkled the text with other facets of their experiences, such as how they dressed and what they wore while escaping, what they took with them, the obstacles they faced, and where they might have gone. I wanted to show the reader the tenacity, skill, and intelligence of these women. And of course, there were so many inspiring stories in the book. And the story of Margaret Grant, who's featured in chapter 2, was inspiring. Margaret escaped slavery twice, first in 1770 and again in 1773. And when she escaped in 1773, she was pregnant. But she escaped both times from Baltimore, Maryland. And in her first escape, she wore men's clothing and sought to conceal her identity by dressing as a waiting boy to an escaped English convict servant named John Chambers. So Margaret sought to escape by passing as both white and male, performing fugitivity in a way that Ellen Craft, another escaped slave, would do decades later. But Margaret was a historical outlier. She was literate. She was a mulatto. She could have very well passed for white. She had experienced slavery on 3 Caribbean islands, and she escaped twice, both times from Baltimore. So through a close reading of the ads, we know a great deal about her life up to the time of her escape. Now, the use of a surname by Margaret reflects her acculturation and Anglicization. We don't know the circumstances surrounding how she came to use the surname Grant, but the use of a surname indicates that she sought to portray a sense of dignity and freedom. Because of course, African Americans during slavery were not given surnames, but they in fact, within their own culture, may have maintained surnames themselves that they certainly did in fact recognize. Now, Jenny is another enslaved woman who is featured in chapter 3, whose story is also inspiring. She was the mother of a 2-year-old daughter named Winnie, and she escaped slavery from Virginia in 1776 after the Declaration of Independence was issued. She was big with child, according to the advertisement of her escape. And Jenny and her child were on the run for 7 months when her enslaver placed a second advertisement for her escape. And her enslaver noted that she would attempt to pass as a free woman and was likely headed to Richmond, Virginia, which had a comparatively large free Black population. Now, Bet was another escaped slave who, at the age of 21, escaped slavery with her 3-year-old daughter in British-occupied Pennsylvania. Now, she escaped in 1781, and 2 white men accompanied them. The involvement of white men in Bet's quest for freedom really served to provide the pathway for a successful escape. It is certainly likely that one of the white men involved in Bet's escape sought to portray Bet and her child as his property through subterfuge, and their presence certainly reduced the likelihood of being stopped by slave patrols or other inquisitive whites. Now, at the end of my book, I discuss a woman named Hannah who escaped slavery twice and lost 2 children to exposure. She was recaptured. Her enslaver, Mary Bowie, petitioned the court in Westmoreland, Virginia, to have Hannah sold because of her recidivism. Now, Hannah's story certainly is one of loss, but also of perseverance and persistence. Each of these stories, Margaret, Bet, Jenny, really are a necessary act of recovery from the trauma in the archive of Black women's experiences. And of course, enslaved women faced many obstacles to freedom, from environmental to physical to the challenges related to the nature of warfare. In terms of environmental challenges, enslaved women had to contend with the elements, be it extreme cold or heat, and women ran away during every season of the year, in the fall, winter, spring, and summer. In terms of physical challenges, women had to contend with the topography, the forests, the creeks, the swamps, and rivers. And in terms of the nature of warfare, they had to deal with challenges regarding remaining in encampments, in British encampments. In Virginia, for example, diseases such as smallpox led to the death of scores of women and men on Gwynn Island in Virginia. So they faced tremendous obstacles, but despite the challenges that they faced, they were determined to risk everything, including their lives, to gain their freedom.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this, even a brief snapshot of the amazing courage of these women and really shining a light on, all that they went through and how they persevered. And those who escaped, multiple times in the quest for freedom and experiencing things that, none of us could even imagine going through on not just once, but multiple times, and the suffering that they went through, but how they persevered. It's really something that so many people don't know much about. And I appreciate your research and your scholarship in really bringing that to the forefront. So when you think about the work that you have done in the research, what was the most interesting discovery that you made when you were doing the extensive research around the slave resistance?
Yeah, certainly. So I discovered in my research that enslaved women escaped by any means possible, on foot, by boat, and even on horseback. There was a woman named Sarah and her 6-year-old son who escaped on horseback from Fredericksburg, Maryland. Now, they were assisted in their escape by a white tailor named Valentine Lind, with whom Sarah had a relationship. Now, the advertisement for Sarah tells us that she took an assortment of clothing with her. She took bedding. She took a large sum of money from her enslaver, who was named George Somerville. So Somerville even placed in the ad that Valentine Lind would probably act as her husband. So again, showing the ways in which women, really through ingenuity, sought to gain their freedom, even taking their children with them. Also, I discovered that African-American women really followed the military conflict and were really powerfully influenced by its outcome. Thousands became free and gave new voice to a growing abolitionist movement. I think of Nan, whose enslaver on November 14th of 1776 placed an advertisement in Boston's Continental Journal for Nan, who was at the age of 27, and she had run away 12 months earlier, a year earlier, she had run away, but the ad was being placed in November of 1776. Now, the ad tells us that Nan wore a blue calico gown that she had taken several clothes with her, and that she told her enslaver that she was going on a visit, perhaps to see friends, but she never returned. So it's stories like Sarah and Nan that really underscore the fact that women developed strategic and ingenious plans as they sought to escape slavery. And clothing, of course, was really important in the advertisements that I examined. Each of the advertisements revealed the kinds of clothing that women either wore or took with them as they were fleeing. And the advertisements really revealed that during this period that women relied on their sense of self and their sense of dignity and humanness to really carry forth the ideal that they wanted to maintain what one historian calls their soul value, their sense of worth, despite being slaves. So clothing becomes a measurement of showing one's sense of dignity and self-worth. And in all of the advertisements that I examined, women are running away with an enormous amount of clothing to take with them to protect them from the elements, from the weather. In the case of Sarah and Nan, they're taking clothing with them that they took from their enslavers. So it becomes a very important way for women to show and portray their humanness and self-worth as people.
That's really remarkable, because I'm sure that most people can't even have an inkling of the importance of something like clothing and what it meant for the journey on to escapism. It's really fascinating. And you remind me of last month attending an exhibit about the history of Maryland. As a matter of fact, you talked a number of times about people running from their enslavers in Baltimore and other places. And as part of the exhibit, one entire wall was nothing but ads in which the enslavers had posted in order to put the word out that they wanted these individuals captured. And I do recall that there were certainly more ads around for men than there were for women. So I don't think the story of the women who escaped, are as prevalent as those of men. And so when they went through all of these hardships, freedom was really the motivation. And once they got free, what was the reality for those who actually succeeded?
Well, certainly freedom was tenuous for those who escaped because they had to find ways to make a living in a society that did not really value their labor. Now, most women, of course, found work as cooks and laundresses, as well as seamstresses to eke out a living to support themselves and their families. And in the northern cities in particular, the free Black community often aided and assisted runaways in making their transition to freedom in places like New York, as well as in further north in New Hampshire. I think of Ona Judge, who was the escaped slave of George and Martha Washington. She was aided by the free Black community in Philadelphia when she escaped in 1796, and she made it to New Hampshire. And there she lived out the rest of her life, eking out a living as a cook and working also as a laundress. So women found ways to support themselves and their families through these occupations that have been historically assigned to Black women as domestic workers, for example, in the homes of white people, working as a seamstress really is a skill that many Black women had throughout history. I think of Elizabeth Keckley, who was a seamstress for President Abraham Lincoln's wife, Martha. So these skills were very important for Black women to take with them as they sought to make a living in freedom. Now, of course, what's interesting about the Revolutionary War and its impact is that it does lead to the gradual end of slavery in the northern states. In Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, for example, they enacted gradual manumission laws to end slavery. And by 1790, there were 59,000 free Blacks in the US, the majority of whom were freed as a result of the Revolutionary War. So when the war ends, it's also important to note that some 3,000 African Americans actually left with the British and were resettled in places like Nova Scotia, in the Caribbean, where unfortunately many were enslaved, as well as England. Now, of course, women and children comprised the majority of the immigrants who left with the British and resettled in Nova Scotia and who were taken to the Caribbean and England. But as I mentioned previously, only about 2 in every 3 fugitives survived the war. And, their road to freedom was really met with obstacles in terms of making a living. Now, in the post-revolutionary period, the period after 1783, women faced significant obstacles to freedom through the law because Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution provided for the capture and return of runaways. And the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 really gave enforcement power to this clause by allowing enslavers to capture and return their runaways. President George Washington, for example, used this act to pursue his runaway slave on a judge who escaped, as I mentioned, in 1796 from the Washington's home in Philadelphia, which was then the nation's capital. Now, after several attempts to recapture her, the Washingtons eventually gave up their pursuit. So, of course, when I think about freedom being the motivation, and of course, the reality for African American women, I think about the fact that throughout history, women have relied on themselves and their community in order to make a living and to support themselves and their families. So they were not certainly bereft of resources. They did use the skill sets and the resources they had in order to support themselves.
Thank you. And, when you talk about what happened, once people became free, those are the many of the stories that people have not gone deeply in depth about. And I alluded to this a few times before. There are certain myths that people hold around enslaved people, whether they're men or women. So what myths do you hope your book will dispel, or what do you hope readers will unlearn in reading your book?
Well, one myth that I hope that readers will unlearn is the idea that Black women did not escape slavery. We know about Harriet Tubman and perhaps Harriet Jacobs, but there are many, many women who did, in fact, escape slavery successfully. And what my book really underscores is that the escape of Black women was really more widespread and really more multifaceted than previously thought. They made the decision to escape for a variety of reasons, and they established various social and economic strategies to achieve their escape. They took drastic measures to secure their freedom and dared to invent alternatives to what enslavers delineated as their position and status within a slave society. So I hope that my book shows that the escape of ordinary Black women really is essential to understanding how Black women built a culture and politics of resistance to slavery. Through ingenuity, we see countless Black women fleeing slavery, providing evidence of their internal fortitude to think critically under pressure in the midst of gendered, racialized, and vulnerable moments in history. They disguised themselves as waiting boys and men. They faked physical and mental illness. They boarded ships headed to northern destinations, which is what Ona Judge did, the escaped slave of George and Martha Washington. So they faced daily threats of bodily harm. And despite that, they imagined the possibility of freedom, and they transformed that possibility into a lived reality. And I would argue in doing so, they outsmarted those who sought to subjugate and belittle them. So certainly in terms of takeaways from this book, one being the fact that Black women did run away from slavery, okay? And second, the fact that Black women were certainly women who were ingenious about the ways in which they escaped, okay? There was no one way to escape, and Black women navigated the terrain, difficult terrain, the best way they could, and with the resources that they either took with them from their enslavers or managed to secure from others who aided and abetted them, but they were ingenious in the ways in which they escaped.
Great. Do you think, in looking at so much of the scholarship that you have done, do you think our nation will ever live up to its core ideals of equality and justice for all?
Well, I think that race has been and still is a fundamental part of the American legal system. And if you study the early slave laws of this country, you really see this, this fact. And Dr. King's often repeated quote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice is really inspiring, but it does not allow for what is perhaps the most significant feature in the story of American freedom, and that is backlash and backwards movement. And I think that 55 years after King's assassination, we just commemorated his assassination on April 4th, that this is really the brutal reality facing America. But I do think it's important for each of us to do our part to create what King called the beloved community by treating one another equally with kindness and respect and showing the agape love that Dr. King discussed throughout his life.
Absolutely. And we all hope that that will become a reality one day. So how do these stories remain, these stories of these remarkable women that you outline and go into detail with in your book, how do these stories remain salient for a new generation of activists who are committed to dismantling systems of oppression in the US and across the world?
Well, certainly, I think about the Black Lives Matter movement and the fact that it was started by three Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Colors, and Opal Tometi, to fight for freedom, liberation, and justice. And really, throughout history, Black women have used their pain to inspire change. I think about Mamie Till, the mother of Emmett Till, who insisted on an open casket for her son and helped launch the modern civil rights movement. So I think about certainly Lucy Macbeth, whose son Jordan Davis was shot to death by a white man for listening to his music too loud. And now she's a member of Congress advocating for gun control. And of course, Sabrina Fulton, the mother of Trayvon Martin, who was shot for simply walking through his father's neighborhood. And of course, her activism helped launch the social justice movement as well. So I think both successful and attempted escapes of enslaved women matter to the present day discourse on freedom and equality because it demonstrates that really throughout history, Black women have been engaged in efforts to dismantle systems of oppression. And by protesting with their feet, by running away, these enslaved women were doing what their forebears would do centuries later. And I think it also represents an important part of Black women's political history that really adds to the discourse of how Black women organized in their communities, protested slavery and segregation, built institutions, and fought for equal access to the ballot. In terms of Stacey Abrams' work in engaging in voting rights for African Americans in Georgia. And of course, she stands on the shoulders of Black women like Mary Church Terrell and others who were instrumental in the suffrage movement, and Ida B. Wells as well. So Black women have been in the forefront of movements to address inequity, social oppression, and freedom for the Black community for centuries. And I would argue that this is a fight that really begins during the Revolutionary era. So I'm a historian, and I really recognize the fact that history is a source of power. And telling these stories really disrupts the master narratives. And I think for this new generation of social activists, they can learn from the history of Black women's organizing and protesting and resistance during the Revolutionary period, because it really speaks to aspects of a collective past that holds present day meaning for the continuous and changing present of slavery's unresolvable past.
Thank you. That was just incredibly inspiring and very, very well said. We have to understand how history connects us to the present, right? And how it can certainly lead us to the change that we want to see happening, not only now, but in the future. So we do have a question. I'm not sure if you mentioned this earlier, but we were talking about Own a Judge, and someone asked the question if George and Martha Washington advertised for the capture of their escaped slaves.
They did. I have an advertisement of Own a Judge from 1796 that has George Washington's name on it. He's placing this advertisement for her, showing that he wants his quote unquote property returned. So yes, the advertisements for their slaves are certainly still in existence. And one thing about the digital age is that all of the records are digitized. So it's really accessible to researchers.
That's great. Thank you. So thank you. If there aren't any more questions, I want to thank you, Dr. Cook-Bell, Karen Cook-Bell, for sharing the stories of these incredibly resilient and powerful women with so much ingenuity and fortitude, and talking about the incredible journeys and the sacrifices that they made in order to secure their freedom and the freedom of their families. Thank you so much also for taking the time to share everything that you have shared with us. I want to just remind everyone who participated, first, thank you for your participation and being with us today. The webinar will be posted on the AAUW website, so keep an eye out for that. Definitely make sure you check out Dr. Karen Cook-Bell's website, and you can find details on any additional projects that she is working on. We hope that you will purchase this and other research that she is undertaking. I want to thank the AAUW national team who supported this webinar for all of your support today. And for everyone, please visit aauw.org and learn more about the upcoming professional development and the educational programs that we have. And you can also check out some information about other great scholars like Dr. Karen Cook-Bell. Again, thank you, Dr. Karen Cook-Bell, for being with us this afternoon. And you may have the last word.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope that there are more people looking at the impact of Black women during this period, the revolutionary period. And I do hope that my work is generative and that there are more people asking questions about Black women during this era. There is so much scholarship that needs to be done on this particular period. Because again, we don't see the same level of scholarship in the 1700s that we do for the 1800s. Please, if you're interested in history, want to learn more about history, read my book and certainly delve more deeply into what Black women were doing to secure freedom and maintain their freedom during this period.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.